There is a hollow in the hill country of western North Carolina where the chestnut trees were already old when the first European settlers arrived. The beekeepers who came into those mountains brought almost nothing with them. No catalogue equipment, no replacement stock, no chemical treatments because there were no chemical treatments. What they brought was observation, and what they built, over 2 centuries of winter losses and spring recoveries, was a set of practices so precisely calibrated to the mountain environment that the colonies they managed are still producing descendants in some of those hollows today. Most people who hear that assume it means something mystical. It does not. It means that the people who kept bees in those mountains paid close attention over a very long time to what worked and what did not, and they kept doing what worked long after the rest of American beekeeping had moved in a different direction. There are 5 things they did that modern beekeeping left behind. Not because those things failed, because there was no product to sell around them. One of these 5 practices, something mountain beekeepers did by habit, by feel, without ever naming what it was, turns out to have a specific biological mechanism that researchers have only recently begun to document. It has nothing to do with chemicals and nothing to do with equipment. It is something the bees were doing to themselves. And for 200 years, these beekeepers knew to protect it rather than disrupt it. We will get to that, but it cannot be understood without understanding the other 4 first. If the kind of beekeeping this channel covers is useful to you, historically grounded, biology first, no products attached, a subscription keeps this content coming. And if you have ever kept bees in a way that looked different from the standard advice, it might be worth sharing that in the comments. The first of these 5 practices begins with the hive itself, not the Langstroth box that became the American standard after 1852. The hive that Appalachian beekeepers were using for a century before Langstroth was born, and that many continued using long after the movable frame hive became commercially dominant. The log gum hive, a section of hollow tree trunk, sealed at both ends with flat stones or fitted wood, with a single small entrance cut at the base. No frames, no inspection, no manipulation of the internal structure at all. Most of what these beekeepers did would look like neglect to a modern eye. That is exactly the point. The log gum hive was not primitive technology. It was an intentional replication of the environment in which honeybees evolved. A tree cavity. The walls were thick, 4 to 6 inches of dense wood, compared to the 3/4-inch pine board of a standard Langstroth box. The interior volume was smaller and more contained. The entrance was narrow by necessity, and the bees did what bees have done inside tree cavities for millions of years. They sealed everything they did not need with propolis. They shaped the interior to their own thermal requirements, and they built a colony environment that the hive structure did not constantly undermine. The physics of that difference matter. Research published in the last 15 years has documented that a standard Langstroth hive loses heat at a rate 4 to 7 times higher than a natural tree cavity of equivalent volume. The wood of the Langstroth box is too thin to provide meaningful insulation. The joints between boxes create convective pathways that a tree cavity does not have. The colony inside a log gum hive is not managing the same thermal problem as the colony inside a Langstroth box. It is managing a much smaller one, but the log gum hive alone was not the first secret. The first secret was what happened to the outside of it. Appalachian beekeepers, particularly in the higher elevations of the Blue Ridge and the Great Smokies, routinely covered their log gum hives with whatever grew naturally in the surrounding hollow. Wild grapevine, Virginia creeper, bittersweet, the dense tangle of dead and living stem that a hollow's edge produced through the growing season was wrapped around and over the hive body, left to dry and compress over winter, and added to in subsequent years. It was not decorative, it was insulation. Dead air trapped in stem and leaf mass surrounding the log, reducing radiant heat loss from the outer wood surface and providing a secondary moisture barrier against the driving rain and ice storms that the mountain winter regularly produced. A colony wrapped this way was not heating a box exposed to the elements. It was heating a contained environment that the wrapping helped maintain. The difference in winter honey consumption between a wrapped log gum hive and an unprotected one showed up in the spring weight of the hive. Beekeepers who tracked this, and some did, with simple weighing stones balanced against known counterweights, noted consistently that wrapped hives emerged from winter heavier. Not dramatically, but reliably. That reliability was the currency of subsistence beekeeping. The second component of the first secret was the entrance. And this is where the Appalachian practice diverges most clearly from modern beekeeping's approach to propolis. In commercial beekeeping today, propolis is managed as a nuisance. It gums up frames, cements boxes together, makes inspections harder and equipment less reusable. The standard practice is to scrape it off during inspections and to clean hive interiors annually. Modern plastic and painted wood hive bodies do not allow propolis adhesion in the same way that raw wood does. The propolis envelope that bees naturally build inside a cavity, the thin, continuous coating of resin they apply to interior walls, joints and crevices, is systematically disrupted or prevented in most managed colonies today. The Appalachian log gum hive was never cleaned. The bees that moved into a log gum hive in year 1 began building a propolis envelope immediately. By year 3 or 4, the interior of that hive was coated with a thin, continuous resin layer that the colony built and maintained according to its own requirements. The entrance diameter changed seasonally, not by beekeeper intervention, but by propolis addition and removal by the bees themselves, expanding it slightly in late spring when the forager force was at its largest, contracting it through summer and fall, sealing it to the smallest practical opening by October. Mountain beekeepers observed this and left it alone. They understood, without the biochemical language to explain it, that the bees knew what size the entrance needed to be. They were right. They were right. They is pulsing fallin, some two of fallin. Say is mudders, say is mudders. Nike pulsing thing reeling. The and say is mudders or. The say is mudders are. The is mudders are. Say is mudders, and the say is mudders, say is mudders are. The propolis envelope inside a log gum hive is not merely a structural feature. It is a biological layer. Propolis has documented antimicrobial properties, active against American foul brood spores, against nosema, against a range of fungal pathogens that thrive in the warm, humid interior of a populated hive. A colony living inside a propolis-coated cavity is living inside what is effectively a low-level antiseptic environment that the colony itself maintains. The annual cleaning habit in modern beekeeping removes that environment and resets it to 0 every spring. The log gum colony never reset it. It built it progressively over years, and the biological protection it provided accumulated accordingly. But the location of that hive, that is the second secret. And the location choice is where something begins that takes a full generation of winter losses to learn. Appalachian beekeepers did not place hives in the open field facing south in the full winter sun. That placement looks intuitive. Sun warms the entrance. Bees can fly on warm winter days. The hive looks active. But the mountain experience, accumulated through decades of comparison, produced a different preference. Hives placed on the upper edge of a north-facing slope, partially sheltered by the canopy overhang of a ridge, protected from the south-facing winter sun. The reason is not what it first appears to be. Verfaeswise, perhaps appears to be. Verfaeswise Puthvarn, on a clear January day in western North Carolina, a south-facing hive entrance can reach 45 or 50 degrees in direct sunlight, while the surrounding air temperature is 25. Bees respond to that localized warmth by breaking cluster, beginning cleansing flights, moving toward the entrance. Then the cloud passes. The temperature drops back to 25 degrees in minutes. The bees that had begun moving are caught between the brood nest and the entrance in temperatures they cannot sustain. They die at the hive entrance. Experienced beekeepers who check their hives in February find these clusters of dead bees precisely at the spot where an unexpected warm episode brought them out, and a cold snap pulled them back down. North-facing placement prevents that cycle. The colony does not receive the false warmth signal. It stays clustered longer. Cleansing flights happen only when ambient temperature genuinely supports sustained flight. The colony's winter honey consumption is lower because it is not being repeatedly triggered into premature activity, and the winter bee population, the diutinous bees whose physiological reserves determine April survival, is not prematurely depleted by partial cluster breaks through January and February. This is not the kind of reasoning that appears in a beekeeping catalogue. It is the kind of reasoning that appears after watching what happens to hives in different positions across 20 or 30 winters. The 30-pound rule was born the same way. Mountain beekeepers who tracked winter losses against fall colony weight arrived, over generations, at a number. 30 pounds of stored honey as the minimum threshold for reliable Appalachian winter survival. Not 60 pounds. Not the higher figures that Pennsylvania or Ohio beekeepers applied, because Appalachian winters, while severe, are also variable. Warm spells in late February reduce consumption. Snow in early March, followed by warm April rains, accelerates build-up. The 30-pound rule was not a guess. It was the number that kept appearing after the winters that killed colonies. They counted backward from the losses. Colonies that went into October under 30 pounds did not reliably make it to March. Colonies above 30 pounds did. The number was not derived from a university study. It was derived from observation repeated across enough seasons that it became transferable knowledge, something a grandfather could tell a grandson without needing to explain the full reasoning behind it, because the outcome spoke clearly enough. A lot of beekeepers today would call this rough math. The biology does not. The third secret involves the mountain calendar, and it is the one that most risks misunderstanding without the right framing. Appalachian beekeepers timed their hive work by the moon. This was not unique to beekeeping. The Appalachian agricultural calendar, planting, harvesting, slaughtering, preserving, was widely organized around lunar cycles, documented in the farmer's almanac tradition that shaped rural American life from the colonial period through the mid-20th century. Root crops were planted in the dark of the moon, above-ground crops in the waxing phase, grafting and division in the period around the new moon. Beekeeping was organized the same way. Swarm trapping, queen rearing, and colony division were timed to specific lunar phases that experience suggested produced better outcomes. Hive inspections were avoided in the 3 days around the full moon, when bees were observed to be more defensive and more likely to abscond during disturbance. There is no confirmed mechanistic explanation for lunar influence on honeybee behavior that meets current research standards. That is worth saying clearly. But there is something else worth saying alongside it. The practice of timing hive work to lunar cycles had a secondary effect that was entirely independent of whether the moon was the actual causal variable. It created a management rhythm. Beekeepers working the lunar calendar did not open hives impulsively. They did not inspect out of anxiety or habit. They scheduled hive work in discrete windows, separated by days of non-intervention. And non-intervention, for a colony-building propolis, regulating temperature and progressing through brood cycles, is often the most productive thing a beekeeper can do. Whether the moon matters to the bees is a question that remains open. Whether regular restraint from intervention benefits the colony is not. Alongside the lunar calendar, Appalachian beekeepers tracked 2 natural flow signals with a precision that outperformed any calendar date: blackberry bloom and sourwood bloom. These two nectar sources function as biological colony assessment points in the Appalachian region, not just as harvest windows. The colonies that could not load up on blackberry flow in June did not have enough forager strength to capitalize on sourwood in July. The beekeeper who watched the blackberry opening and compared the activity at different hive entrances had, in that single observation, a forager population assessment that no frame inspection could provide as quickly. Heavy forager traffic into the hive during blackberry flow, corbiculae loaded, the sound inside the hive shifted, denser, more resonant. These were the colonies that would fill the sourwood frames. The quiet ones at blackberry would struggle. Honey was not harvested on a calendar schedule. It was harvested when the sourwood flow had visibly peaked and declined, when forager traffic thinned, when the hive sound shifted again toward the quieter register of a colony consolidating winter stores rather than processing incoming nectar. These were not imprecise signals, they were specific biological transitions that beekeepers learned to read across many seasons. The mountain beekeepers did not need a refractometer. They had watched these transitions enough times to know what they meant. The fourth secret involves getting the bees in the first place, and keeping the operation stocked, without ever placing a catalogue order. Appalachian swarm trapping was a serious practice, not a casual hobby. In mountain communities where purchasing replacement stock was either unaffordable or logistically impossible, the ability to catch a swarm meant the difference between a productive colony and an empty hive standing through summer. The method was specific, and the specificity mattered. Swarm traps were not built from new materials. They were built from old ones. The interior of a used log gum hive that had housed a colony for several seasons was the ideal catch box, because it already carried the olfactory signature that scouts respond to: propolis volatiles, old beeswax residues, the chemical memory of prior occupation. New wood carries none of these signals. Plastic carries even less. Where new bait material was needed, mountain beekeepers rendered old comb, pure beeswax only, and applied it to the interior surfaces of the catch box in a thin layer that mimicked the scent profile of a recently vacated cavity. The combination of old wood, rendered beeswax, and residual propolis created a lure that synthetic alternatives cannot reliably replicate, because the scouts are not responding to a single chemical signal. They are responding to a combination of olfactory cues that together signal a cavity with prior successful colony history. Trap placement followed the same logic as hive placement. Not south-facing, not in open sun, on the upper edge of a hollow, in the light shade of an overhang, at a height between 8 and 15 feet, the range at which Appalachian scouts most commonly investigated cavities, based on the natural distribution of appropriate tree cavities in that elevation range. And when a swarm was not being trapped, it was sometimes hunted. The hunted bee lining is the Appalachian practice of tracking a feral honeybee colony back to its tree cavity by following individual foragers from a bait station to their hive. The beekeeper would set a small dish of diluted honey or sugar syrup at a known foraging location, wait for bees to discover it, and then track the direction of their return flight. The return flight of a loaded forager is a straight line, the bee line, aimed directly at the hive entrance. By triangulating from two bait stations positioned at different angles, a patient beekeeper could locate the tree cavity within a radius of a few hundred yards. The patience the bee lining method required, and what it demanded of the person doing it, was not incidental. It was practice. It trained the beekeeper to watch individual bees moving through space with the kind of attention that later translated directly into reading hive entrance behavior as a management diagnostic. The beekeeper who had spent hours following flight lines across a mountain clearing was a beekeeper who noticed things at the entrance of a managed hive that others walked past. The colonies that came from bee lining were not random genetics. They were feral survivors. Colonies that had overwintered in uninsulated tree cavities without treatment, without supplemental feeding, without any management at all, and had survived to produce swarms strong enough to attract a beekeeper's attention. In the context of Varroa, which in the Appalachian wild population has been present since the late 1980s, these colonies represent the genetic fraction of the population that either suppresses mite reproduction through hygienic behavior or sustains colony viability despite mite load. Selecting from that pool was not genetic management in any formal sense, but it was selection, and it produced results that were visible in winter survival rates across the mountain operations that practiced it consistently. The colonies that survived weren't the ones the beekeeper protected most. They were the ones he interfered with least. The fifth secret is the hardest one for modern beekeeping to sit with. It involves queen rearing, and it is built entirely on a decision not to act. When a healthy Appalachian colony produced queen cells, emergency cells from a virgin egg, superseer cells from a failing queen, or swarm cells from a congested brood nest, the mountain beekeeper's default response was to leave them alone. Not all of them, not in every situation, but the default was restraint. The colony was allowed to make its own selection. This sounds passive. It is not. But est tout un pas. This not, a colony producing multiple queen cells is conducting a biological evaluation that the beekeeper cannot replicate. The workers attending each cell are assessing larval quality, royal jelly production, pheromone output, and a range of chemical signals that have no equivalent in human judgment. The cell that the workers choose to maintain, feeding it consistently, building it to full depth, attending it with nurse bees while allowing competitor cells to be destroyed, is the cell that the colony's internal evaluation system has determined most likely to produce a queen that will sustain the colony. In a conventional managed hive, this process is frequently overridden. The beekeeper selects the cell that looks largest, or best positioned, or most recently built. The selected cell is moved, the others are destroyed. The colony's evaluation is bypassed by a decision made on visual criteria that do not correlate with the biological variables the workers were actually assessing. What they were preserving inside that log, they did not have a name for it, but they knew not to wash it away. The Appalachian mountain beekeeper who left the queen cells alone was not being careless. He was recognizing the limits of his own knowledge relative to the colonies. In a subsistence context where purchasing a replacement queen was not an option, a failed queen introduction was a genuine catastrophe. The colony's own selection, arrived at through a process refined across millions of years of evolution, was the more reliable choice. It did not always produce the best possible outcome. It produced the most consistently adequate one, and across generations of that practice, in environments where only the most resilient colonies produced swarms worth catching, and only the most capable queens built colonies worth overwintering, the genetic stock that mountain beekeepers were working with drifted steadily toward cold hardiness, propolis production, disease resistance, and winter survivability. Not by intention, but by consequence. This is the logic that connects all 5 secrets. And this is where they converge. The log gum hive created a thermal and biological environment that the Langstroth box cannot replicate without significant modification. The site selection protected winter bees from the cycle of false warmth and fatal cold. The mountain calendar created management restraint that prevented the disruption of biological processes the colony needed to complete undisturbed. The swarm trapping and bee lining drew from the most resilient genetic pool available, and the queen selection practice allowed the colony's own biology to determine who would lead it. None of these 5 practices require a purchase. None of them have a product attached. They require observation, patience, and the discipline to understand that the beekeeper's role in a healthy colony is often to stay out of the way of what the colony is already doing correctly. The practice that modern research has most recently begun to validate, the one planted at the opening of this piece, is the propolis envelope. The colony inside the log gum hive that was never cleaned, never scraped, never reset, was building and maintaining an antimicrobial layer that reduced pathogen load, reduced drastic temperature fluctuation, and created a colony environment fundamentally different from the clean, dry, annually scraped Langstroth interior. Studies published in the last decade have documented measurably lower nosema loads, lower bacterial counts, and stronger immune markers in colonies living in high propolis environments compared to those in cleaned hives. The mountain beekeeper never measured any of that. He watched the colony. The colony that was allowed to build and maintain its own interior environment survived better, reproduced more reliably, and produced more consistently across variable seasons. So he left it alone. That is not mysticism. That is 200 years of careful observation arriving at a biologically correct conclusion without the language to explain it. The explanation came later. The practice came first. Modern beekeeping is organized around intervention, around product, around treatment, around the assumption that the beekeeper's judgment applied regularly is an improvement on what the colony would produce without it. The Appalachian mountain tradition was organized around a different assumption, that the colony's biology, given the right environment and the right degree of protection from well-meaning interference, was capable of managing most of what it needed to manage. That assumption was not always correct. Colonies died in the mountains. Bad seasons happened. Queens failed. Mites arrive now in those hollows, as they arrive everywhere. These practices are not a complete answer to contemporary beekeeping challenges, and anyone who presents them as such is selling something, but they are a corrective. A reminder that intervention and management are not the same thing, and that the history of beekeeping contains a long tradition of producing healthy colonies, strong winter survivors, and productive honey years through alignment with what the bee was already doing. Rather than correction of what the bee was presumably doing wrong, the mountain beekeeper walking that ridge trail in October was not checking hives because something needed fixing. He was checking because he wanted to know. There is a difference between those two orientations, and it shows in the colonies those beekeepers left behind. If any of these 5 practices resemble something you have done by instinct, or something you have tried and abandoned, or something your grandfather did that you were told was outdated, it might be worth leaving that below. The most durable beekeeping knowledge often travelled exactly that way, not through publications, through someone watching, recording what they saw, and telling the next person. And if this kind of biology first, history first approach to the craft is what you come here for, the subscription keeps more of it coming. The biology behind these mountain practices has not changed. The colonies inside those hollows are running the same thermal physics, the same propolis chemistry, the same queen selection mechanisms that they were running 200 years ago. What changed is whether the beekeeper standing outside the entrance knows enough to leave well enough alone. That knowledge was not lost. It was set aside. And most of what was set aside still works.